Greetings all, this is Alexander von Marstall, the editor-in-chief of the Warden Post and your host at MetaVisions, the official podcast of the Warden Post. Today I have an immense pleasure to have with me Dr. Alexander Jacob. Dr. Jacob, welcome to MetaVisions.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Jacob obtained his PhD in History of Ideas from Pennsylvania State University, and he's the author of books like Nobilitas, a study of aristocratic philosophy from ancient Greece to the early 20th century, which we will discuss into more depth during this episode of MetaVisions. Also, Atman, a reconstruction of the solar cosmology of the Indo-Europeans. His major editions of German conservative political thinkers include Edgar Julius Jung's The Rule of the Inferior, which is a tremendously important book in order to understand the conservative revolution between the two world wars, the Anthology Europa, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Political Idea. Today we will be discussing the importance and the influence the aristocratic philosophy had on the Western discourse and how we can basically use it in order to articulate a more authentic culture of living. Dr. Jacob, what happened to the aristocratic in the West?
Well, I mean, it has ceased to exist, apparently. I think that you know the history of modern Europe and about the violent revolutions that brought an end to the Habsburg Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian. And all of this was done violently through wars and through revolutions. So obviously, it's a concerted attack on empire, the idea of imperium. And it seems to have succeeded, at least for a century. Now, the question is, how do we revive it, especially since there are not so many aristocrats around who are politically involved. So I think, it's the 19th century and the 20th century that are responsible for the end of the aristocratic rule of Europe through revolution, obviously. And these were organized, well-organized movements.
Right. So basically what happened in the West is the aristocracies of old Europe lost the position of being key political players into the decision-making of the respective European or Western empires, if you would prefer so. And now they exist on the margins, right? Do you think that they also lost the will to participate into the political life in Europe due to certain factors? Or were they forced out of the political life in Europe? I mean, I think the last push out was during the European revolutions of 1848. We all know what was happening in Hungary, in Central Europe, etc., right?
Right.
How would you frame that?
It began with those socialist revolutions, and then they intensified with the Russian Revolution of the early 20th century. And then the two world wars put a final end to all empires, including the National Socialist Third Reich, which is also an empire of its own. So there is a very organized effort to bring down all monarchies and all empires. That much is clear, except insofar as they're constitutionally circumscribed, as in England. They're just a decoration to the parliamentary processes that predominate. So, it's clear. Now, you say, have they lost their will? Well, I don't know. Most of them have lost their lives also, in all those violent revolutions. So it's a different world now. And as for the will to have aristocratic government, well, it's not exclusive to born aristocrats. Anyone who, has an idealistic worldview or viewpoint has an aristocratic viewpoint. And so he can, reformulate an aristocratic government if only he can find, companions to do it and power to establish it. So it's not necessary that only the old aristocrats continue to rule or revive. Even modern folk who are not aristocratic can, if they are completely idealistic in their philosophical viewpoints.
Right. So what you're saying to do is that being an aristocrat is not a state of birth as much as it's a state of soul and mind, right? Which leads us to the point that we can actually revive the aristocratic in the West.
Well, I don't know. It is actually related to your physical constitution, your physiological, your psychological, and it's not easy for anyone to say, he's an aristocrat in spirit or something, unless he gives an example of it through his entire life and his commitment to, this particular worldview that is idealistic rather than materialistic. So it's not open to anybody. It's not like a democratic office that's open to anyone who gets votes. You have to have that nature as well. So
yeah. No, sorry. Continue by all means.
Born aristocrats have the advantage of having it in their blood, in their family, through long generations. Those who are not of this class, will have to prove it by their devotion to the same ideals that inform the original aristocrats, if not all aristocrats. Many aristocrats have degenerated also.
So it's an interesting thing to notice that, as you mentioned, I couldn't put it in a better way, that, for example, the British aristocracy has become just a mere decoration of the state, right? Plays a ceremonial role in a way as an integral part of a constitutional monarchy. That is the fact. That same degradation happened in Germany with the fall of the Second German Empire and the dethronement of the Hohenzollerns as a destiny, as a dynasty. Now, of course, the Junkers as a class in East Prussia found a way to preserve their culture of living by taking over the army and leading quite a militaristic way of life. They still didn't entirely succumb in an instance of time, but that degradation was a consecutive process of downfalls, of course. Now, Dr. Jacob, as we find ourselves today with the approaching singularity, right, with post-humanism, which will be a dehumanized phase of our existence and maybe quite a morbid end of history stage, we're supposed to look towards certain values which will prove a valid platform to orient ourselves in order to establish the European imperium or the imperium of the West or even Euro-Siberian Confederation. It all depends on the historical circumstances and the political conditions of struggle which we'll be facing. My question for someone who has so extensively written and researched the philosophical platforms of the aristocratic in the West, my question for you is, how do we turn all those young, disillusioned people in the West who spend their times watching pornography, aimlessly existing, not living life to the fullest potential, spending most of their days in front of a console, doing 9-to-5 jobs, etc., right? I mean, by all right, I think that I wouldn't be wrong if I claim that that's quite a degenerated culture of living, right?
Right.
How do we make the aristocratic attractive for them?
Right. No, we don't have to. First of all, aristocracy is not a mass movement. It does not involve the people at all. It is always organized at the top, at the highest levels, highest strata of society. So it's the chosen few, the best people who rule the Roman Senate or the House of Lords in England and so on. So it's always a few people. It's never the masses, and you don't have to, and you cannot convert the masses into aristocrats. This is why all populism, there are many populist movements, Marine Le Pen in France and Salviani in Italy and so on. These are going to be anti-aristocratic, just democratic movements with a kind of nationalist flavor. They're not aristocratic. For an aristocratic movement, you need to get a core of people that are elevated above the masses and then formulate a society and a state for them, because the people who are playing video games are not going to do that and never will.
I
So
do agree with you. My point here, I know that speaking about the aristocratic is speaking about the chosen few, which emanate a certain higher set of values. And I do agree with you that not everyone might be that. But would you agree that it's quite an interesting module of expressing the individual? What if we can offer a platform for people to strive towards, even if they don't achieve that matter, they would still improve their lives gradually? What's your take on that?
well, you say individualism is the problem. The problem of democracy is that it makes everybody so individualist that they have no other concern but their own material interests, and that is what makes them atomized and fragmented and completely useless for political life. So individualism is the problem. All materialist civilization, whether it is communist or capitalist, is ultimately based on the material needs of a person. He's either struggling to get them, as in Soviet Russia, or has already got too much of what he wanted in the West. So that is not the basis of an aristocratic government. Now, individualism, insofar as related to the personality of the individual, is another matter. In fascism really is the only heir, legitimate heir of aristocracy. Italian fascism, in particular, in the works of Gentile and Evola and so on, have very stirring, very inspiring descriptions of the state and of the importance of cultivating the personality to the dimension of the state, so that it becomes larger than individual or extremely personal. And so that is the corrective. The corrective is where the individual develops his personality in a much larger dimension. First, that of the state, and finally, in the realm of religion, that is, dimension of the cosmos itself. So individualism only in a philosophical sense, not in this materialistic sense that passes for individualism in America in particular. And part of the problem is also Protestantism, which is an individualistic degeneration of Catholicism, which originally ruled Europe. And so you have all the northern states, America and so on, bound to Protestantism, which is committed to this petty individualism. So with these forces, you're not going to get any aristocratic empire back. You need a different kind of commitment to something larger than your own individuality, and first to the state, and then to the sphere of religion, which is really the universe itself.
And how do you propose that we take that course?
Well, you must have that aptitude already in yourself. That is, you cannot be a selfish person. You cannot be a commercially oriented person. Today's world is a world of commerce and business, and all the politicians are supported by businessmen or are businessmen, as Donald Trump.
Controlled by a businessman, since the
Right,
money flow for the campaign comes directly from the war chest of the
right,
globalist agenda. So I do agree with you.
right. So first of all, you have to elevate politics above business. Business has to, sink in value, and it has to be sort of condemned. It cannot be admired as if it were a political phenomenon. It is not. Donald Trump is not a president. He should never have become president. He should never be re-elected, and so on. So all of this is a mockery of politics. So you have to have a different point of view altogether. It's very difficult to acquire, especially in America, which is so commercially successful. It is easier in the quieter, simpler countries, probably in Eastern Europe, also in Western Europe, which is more Catholic, and so on. So that is quite important. Protestantism, the development of capitalism in America, all of this is a great disadvantage for the West, especially the Anglosphere. But it is more viable in Europe which has more of a Catholic tradition and an aristocratic tradition.
Speaking about the United States of America, it's a really interesting thing that you pointed out that America is the personification of the most brutal aspects of individualism, liberalism, of course, and the dehumanizing effects of a capitalist mode of economic reproduction. It's really interesting that the founding fathers didn't have that idea, Dr. Jacob. I think that we both would agree that the founding fathers of the United States of America, they had quite an interesting aristocratic concept for the original 13 colonies. There weren't political parties or anything. The Federalist Assembly was made of probably some of the best people of the Anglo-Saxon colonial stock, which lived in the USA, especially in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and so on. Those were people who represented the communities, and they elevated life onto something higher. I think what happened in the USA happened later with the introduction of populist measure and the introduction of both the Democrat and the Republican Party. Would you agree on that?
I don't know. It was founded by Puritans, and I have no love for the Puritans or for really Protestantism in general. The Puritans are, as I said, a very individualistic group. It's Protestant, and it encourages personal communication with God, abandoning all hierarchy, religious hierarchy, the priests, and so on and so forth. All of this is symptomatic of extreme individualism. And so I don't see anything aristocratic in that. And it's not surprising that they ultimately fought against the British rule, George III, and got rid of it. So no, it's not aristocratic. It's really quite democratic. Democratic movements began in the 17th century in England under the impulse of Puritanism. And John Locke was a Puritan, and all of these people are Puritans. So democracy itself is based in Puritanism, and Puritanism is the foundation of America. So it may have been different then from what it is now, because now it's multicultural and unrecognizable as a British colony or anything. But I don't think it was aristocratic at any time. They were characterized by a love of freedom and hard work to build up their communities because they were in the wild, in the wilderness. And they're like communes or something, like kibbutz in Israel and that sort of thing. That is the foundation of America. It is not aristocratic. I don't think so.
So would you then say that the geography also can have an influence on a worldview? This is a small digression, but an interesting topic, because you mentioned that they had to subjugate nature in order to geographically expand their territory and to find a more suitable agricultural land, right? Because that was much needed. Would you say geography is important in this regard?
Geography certainly is. Europe has a more temperate, a moderate kind of climate and landscape. America is primitive. The Grand Canyon, the Rockies, all of these are, the primeval geographical formations. And it's very difficult to live a cultured European life in these surroundings. So, yeah, certainly it had an influence, I think. And so it must have been very difficult for them. But you see, in Australia, which is also a very different kind of continent from Europe, the British settlers have managed to retain a kind of British culture much more successfully than the Americans. That means they did not have the spirit of freedom and adventure that the Americans had. They were just British settlers there. That's because the masses were just convicts or something, the lower strata of society, and they were ruled by British colonialists. That is the upper classes of Britain. So Australia still has a kind of British culture. America does not. It is very, very different, the way they speak and act and so on and so forth. And these are both, very alien landscapes. So landscape certainly has an influence, and America has a gigantic kind of landscape to contend with. But it's also the people, the Puritans, who have developed in this different way, I think.
Speaking about geography, that brings us to our future prognosis about what will happen with the contemporary elites. Will they actually fortify themselves through a new globalist module of execution of political power, or can we actually find a process of the foundation of a new elite, which will be more aristocratic in the West, as a process of reaction towards the cultural decay and degeneration happening in the
Right.
West?
Right.
Which country do you think has the best conditions to bring this new elite into life?
It has to be Western Europe, one of the Western European countries. It has to be France or Germany or Italy. Those are the three major countries. All the others are satellite countries. Britain, unfortunately, has broken away from Europe, so it's sort of sinking into the Atlantic. And Trump land.
Sinking into the Atlantic politically or geographically, or both of them?
Not geographically, politically.
I know what you mean.
Right. Britain actually has a very strong aristocratic foundation. You will notice that as soon as you go to Britain, because all of the different strata of society are influenced heavily by the upper class, the aristocratic. So all of their manners and their customs, their courtesy and so on, all of that comes from the upper class.
From the gentry, from the gentrification of a certain sector of the demographics in the UK. I know that's something you and me both have in common. I know that you finished your education in Leeds. I was living not far away from Leeds. I spent quite a decent amount of time in Sheffield, in Nottingham, in the Midlands, and I lived for quite a long part of my youth in Devon, in the south of England. So I'm well familiar with all the contrasts present on the island.
Good. So you have noticed that the whole of British society has a kind of aristocratic flavor because their aristocratic foundations are very strong. You're back?
Yes, I am. Technical issues. I apologize for that.
So actually, Britain, if it can rejoin Europe, is another country that could, revive an aristocratic kind of ethos and society. But I don't know where it's going now. It's going into the Atlantic, as I said. So that is a great misfortune. That leaves France and Germany and Italy. And I was in France recently, spending a month there, and I was just impressed by the great courtesy and the hospitality of the people there. All of that indicates, an original aristocratic culture, which is well established, because courtesy comes from the court, actually. And so
not only etymologically, but really, actually, that's the whole idea.
Right. When you have an aristocratic society, an ancient aristocratic society, you will find that the people are also more elevated in their manners than in a vulgar society, a democratic society like America, for instance. So, yeah, I would say a Western European country, France, Germany, Italy. Russia is aristocratic also, obviously, until the revolution. But it's so vast, and at the moment it's an oligarchy, it's a capitalist kind of country, and also the languages are East and Indo-European, so it's very difficult for anything to start from the East. So it would have to be a Western European country.
So you are convinced that a certain renaissance and a new elite might only emerge, I mean, the one we need might emerge only in Western Europe.
Right.
What about...
Sorry, if I may add.
Absolutely.
They have the advantage of having the original religion, Christian religion, with them. France. So I would say France or Italy rather than Germany also, because Germany became Lutheran and Protestant. So since France is more powerful than Italy, France has the best advantage. Yes, Catholicism.
Speaking about Christianity, oh, sorry, by all means, please finish your expose.
It's about Christianity. Catholicism, by the way, is the strongest religious foundation of a new Europe because it is the oldest form of Christianity in Europe, and it developed actually very, very early in France. It's called the eldest daughter of the church. So, right, go ahead. Yeah.
That brings me, I do apologize if I interrupted your thought strain there. There is something really interesting happening on the edges of politics in the West in general, especially among the dissident or the real right. There is a tendency, the dissident right, to rename itself as the real right, which I ultimately support to the biggest extent. People are discussing the future Christianity has in Europe. Now, speaking about aristocracy, I have the notion that you place Christianity to have quite a vital role into the concept of the aristocratic in the West. Can we talk about a non-Christian aristocracy in the manner of ancient Greece or ancient Rome?
You can, if you can remember any of it. It's so far in the past, and it was absorbed by Christianity. So there's no need to go back and revive the worship of Jupiter or Saturn or anything of the sort.
But you would agree that there is quite a strong revival of Asatru paganism and even of Mediterranean paganism happening in Europe.
No, I don't think it's very strong. It's probably, happening, but it cannot really take over. First of all, for a religious movement to occur, you need an avatar, a person of great charisma, to spread the word, like Christ or Muhammad or the Buddha or something. It'll concretize around such a figure. You don't have any such figure among Asatru or whatever, Mediterranean paganism. They can, imitate some ancient cults through some research, but all of that will remain academic and marginal. It will not become a widespread religion anyway. And it's not necessary. As I said, Greek and Roman elements have already been absorbed into early Christianity. And if you want real pagan gods, you can come to India, but you will see how different the Indian culture is and somewhat alien to. You don't need to go so far or so back in time to become religious. You already have a long historical tradition of religion, starting with Catholicism.
But,
are you still there?
Yeah. Yes, I most certainly am. I just want to add that my video is out because the battery apparently, it's just a technical issue. I most certainly will continue on audio because what's really important is the conversation we're having. A really interesting thing is that in the meantime, we can see the decline of Christianity. The Catholic Church is not what it used to be. Now, even if we speak about the Catholic Church, it's still a very strong and potent political agent in the West, but not as an organic factor of stability, but rather as a factor which only facilitates and strengthens the anti-cultural forces in the West. Right? We can see that happening after Vatican 2.0 in 1968, was it, or 1965? I'm not sure about the year, which is not the most important thing. The real important thing here is to discuss which strain of Christianity can be used as a platform to bring a rejuvenation to the spiritual in Europe. A lot of people have been flogging towards Eastern Christianity or Orthodox Christianity. I think that we both would agree that Protestantism is pretty much dead. And it doesn't prove to be a spiritual platform. Catholicism tends to go that way, and it is accelerating. Would it be possible that Orthodox Christianity might eventually spread towards the West?
No, I don't think so. That is the Greek Christianity. The religion is based on, Greek liturgies and doctrines and so on. It's a completely different kind of system from the Latin. The basis of Western Europe, which is quite large and very important in the development of European civilization, is Latin. It's not Greek. And now to go back to Greek is just too difficult. And, it's spread among the Slavic countries. It is good for them, but only for them, because they have that tradition over a long period of time. There is no need to introduce Greek Christianity into the West when they already have Latin.
But what if that Latin Christianity is not the Latin Christianity it used to be as an organic spiritual force, but actually acts against the interest of Western culture? That is my question.
Right. That's what people say, that, it's working against Europe. I don't think it's working. It has its own agenda. The Jesuits have always been, a militant group, and they want to rule the world, as it were, through Christianity. So they still have that agenda, I think. And that is why.
Yes, but would you also say that they're quite socialistic in their approach towards things? A lot of scholars would claim that Jesuitism is the proto-modern socialism we witnessed spreading in Europe during the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century.
Right. That's what Ebola said about Catholicism. He said it's more socialist than spiritual. Well, I don't know. It is still the same religion. It has the same doctrines. It has the same hierarchy. All of this you will not find in Protestantism at all. So, and they have great veneration for the Pope, who is a representative of God on earth and so on. All of this is very elevated, and it can be reformed if you, take the trouble to understand the original Christian doctrines and follow them and so on. You can do it. But for that, you have to start going to church again and so on. Most young people, I think, are not interested in that. At least the older people must set an example. So the church has to be revived, made a living institution. In Poland, the people are still very Catholic and very religious, I think, because I lived in Poland for a year. And I found them much more active in a Catholic religious way than the people in the West. So it is possible, it depends on the family and the upbringing and how much religion is inculcated in the family and in school and so on. All of this has to be revived. So it's possible, even if it's difficult.
So basically, you do believe that there is a point of return for Catholicism?
Well, that's the only way. I cannot think of any other religion that will pull Europe up. And you need a religious basis to become strong. Without religion, there is no culture at all.
No, I do absolutely 100 undisputedly % agree with you, Dr. Jacob. I might be slightly biased as an Orthodox Christian. I don't know to which denomination do you belong. I presume you are Catholic yourself, if I might ask?
No, actually, my mother belonged to a Syrian Orthodox church. It's a more ancient church than the Catholic, I think. It's a Middle Eastern church from Syria.
Yes, I am familiar with them.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I just want to point out that I might be biased when it comes to Orthodox Christianity. Now, I'm not saying that Orthodox Christianity is the paramount form of the Christian spiritual expression, far be it from it, But there is a reason why Orthodox Christianity has not been, up to today, infiltrated by certain anti-cultural distorting agents like the Catholic Church, which only leads us to the conclusion that a decentralized form of organized religion might not be so much susceptible to corruption as a highly centralized one, right? And there is quite a long tradition of Orthodox monarchies. It's not only the Byzantine Empire, the Bulgarian Empire, the Serbian Empire during the Nemanites, and the time of the rule of Dusan the Strong, the first Serbian emperor. Now, I would say that the Bulgarian and the Serbian Empire do belong to the Occident and to the West. And this is why I have been so strong in an argument of a certain, let's say, Eastern promises concept, where Orthodox Christianity enters the spiritual life of Western Europe. Of course, let's just agree that we disagree. You do believe that there might be a second revival of Catholicism. I do believe that Orthodox Christianity might be a better solution, but only time will say. That brings us back to the aristocratic again. In a way, do you wanted to say something? The last thing I want to do is interrupt you.
I don't think Orthodox Christianity is Occidental. It's still Eastern. I was in Bulgaria also for a year. It's a different country because it's Slavic. All Slavic countries, have accommodated to Orthodox Christianity, and so it's natural for them. It is not natural in the West at all.
We have a comment from Lady Rota, who basically wrote us that ultra-traditional pre-Vatican II Catholicism is on the rise. Now, I haven't seen that, so I cannot comment on it. Many young people are rejoining Rome despite the rot in the Vatican. Logos is rising, which is something Dr. E. Michael Jones, who also was a guest at the Metavisions, is pointing out. I do agree with you that Catholicism, especially traditionalist one, is on the rise in Poland, Croatia too. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to visit Croatia. It is a Slavic country, but it is in principle essentially a Western country, just like Poland is, I believe.
Right. Right. So it's possible. It just depends on the people who are ruling these states, how much they encourage participation of the church. And that is important. This division of church and state is a horror, is an abomination. Somehow the church has to return to its proper place in government. The Islamic countries are doing quite well as Islamic republics, and with consultation with their religious leaders and so on. If they can do it, I think Europeans also can do it. They did it for many centuries. So
yeah, definitely. I think that we cannot imagine the Europe we have today. I mean, the organic form of Europe, the pre-liberal, pre-1945 Europe. That kind of Europe can only be imagined and observed through the lenses of Christianity, the influence of Christian theological doctrine. It facilitated civilizational building and the development of the legal system in a way which can only be prescribed to Europe, and which is an original philosophical product of Western thinking. I do agree with you. Christianity is inseparable part. Unfortunately, from what we can see, we are seeing a massive replacement of Christianity, not only demographically with Islam, and by importing huge chunks of culturally incompatible demographics into the Occident. Christianity cannot mobilize itself not only spiritually but also politically, because let's be real, there has to be a political religious mobilization, not only a spiritual one, which leaves the native peoples of Europe in a state of, I would say, political paralysis on one side and the spiritual crisis on the second one. Now, even if there will be an elite, because let's face it, I think, Dr. Jacob, that what we have as elites ruling us at the moment, they're the most anti-aristocratic and pro-plebeian thing we have on this planet. Would you agree?
Right, because they're just businessmen, mostly speculators and that sort of thing. No, they cannot be considered as elites at all. These are just bankers, and financiers who have usurped a political office. And I'm always thinking of Donald Trump as an example. So, no, these cannot be considered as elites at all. They never were, never will be. So one has to form a new elite, and it has to be a religious one also. And they have to create a state that includes religion as well. So that is the only solution. There are people forming populist parties and so on, but there's no mention of any religion at all amongst them, and so they're useless also. So you need a real aristocratic. There is Action Française or something, I think it's a little more Catholic. I told you, France has more of this Catholic tradition and it is stronger in its foundations than other countries. Okay, go ahead. You were saying?
I just wanted to say that, I mean, look, your intellectual contribution to the West, I'm just humbled. Through your history, you have edited writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Edgar Julius Jung, who was anti-populist to the core and one of the key figures in the German conservative revolutionary movement. You edited Alfred Rosenberg, even Eugen Düring, Robert Stroikers, Charles Mauras. You're very, very well familiar with the history of Western elites, including the period of the aristocratic, of course, up to the point of its decline. And this is the reason why I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm implored to do so by the importance of this question. How do you predict that this new pro-European, pro-organic elite will articulate itself? How will it emerge? How will it bring changes?
Right. As I suggested earlier, the direct heir of aristocracy is fascism, actually. Especially in Italian fascism, you have a lot of political philosophy that is very, very inspiring, especially Giovanni Gentile. Nobody reads him, but he's very, very important as a political thinker. And another more popular figure is Evola. More people, I think, are familiar with his works. And in Evola, too, you have a lot of fascist principles that are enunciated in a very clear and attractive way. So this is the only way there is. And this is why the last resistance to materialism, communism, and so on was through fascism and National Socialism, right, during the Second World War. So that is where you start from. Of course, there's been a tremendous break after the end of the war and the failure of the Third Reich, the defeat of it, and so on. But in order to recover some of the aristocratic ethos, you would have to go the same route as the fascists and the National Socialists. Not all of the way that they took, but some of the principles. That's why I've translated so many works from Germany, because they were very, very different then, very conscious of their idealistic philosophical background, their religious, their imperial, and so on. And so one has to gain inspiration from them and ideas also from them. That is the way to start. The foundation has already been laid for us by them. You don't have to recreate it like a neo-pagan cult or anything. It's already there in the history.
So we basically, for inspiration, we just have to go back to our recent modern history, right? No, of course, you put it well. There is a strong stigma, and that's for a reason, on both National Socialism and fascism, right? But also, on the other hand, there is something quite attractive about them, and that's probably the glorification of strength, imploring people to be Promethean in a way to take their own fate into their own hands, right? And then that transmits.
That is not fascism or National Socialism. It's not about Nietzsche and Superman or anything of the sort. All of that is modern vulgarization of fascism. Fascism is not about being strong because you're a bodybuilder. It is about being strong spiritually. And as a person who is aristocratic, who is elevated spiritually, is conscious of suffering, of the suffering of the whole of humanity and of nature. Sorry, and is filled with a desire to elevate man from his present condition, which is a pathetic one, a tragic one. So he's not just a show-off who's a braggart, who's a kind of mortal or something. But he's someone who's really aware of the need to help humanity. The Catholic tradition has this virtue of, wanting to uplift mankind. And so that is what an aristocrat is, not a strong figure or something, but a spiritually developed one. So I think you have a different view of fascism. Maybe that's been propagated after the war as full of, military generals and cruel people and so on. No, that is not so. In fact, National Socialism, all of this is marked by discipline, severe discipline, a kind of ascetic discipline which resembles the discipline of the original Catholic Church. So, no, it's a very different conception of fascism.
So would you say that the concept of fascism has been distorted by modern historians?
Right, deliberately, because they don't like it at all. They would rather succeed as businessmen than act as politicians.
Professional politicians, the worst kind of them, I would say.
Yeah, they're only professional politicians. They have to be real leaders, with a concern for the whole state and the people. So all of this is very, very different.
Well, of course it is. We can't even talk about leaders nowadays. We can talk about technocrats, and we can talk about servants which are subjugated by the economic need of capital to expand and reproduce itself, taking a huge toll on the human aspects of our existence, right? It's the same with politics nowadays, Dr. Jacob.
Well, that's because politics has been taken over by business, you see, and business is only work, buying and selling things and using them and reselling them and so on. It's just commerce. And when you have that, you have machines, and then you have IT and high tech and so on and so forth. So you go farther and farther away from yourself, which is your humanity and your spiritual capacity. So that's because business has usurped the place of politics and religion. Politics and religion go together. Business is the opposite end of it. And so one has to, discriminate carefully between real politicians and professional and business leaders,
right,
and so
because
on.
Politics is an activity related to power. That's the first thing, as Carl Schmitt would put it. And an interesting thing is about how we execute that political power. Now, you have made a brilliant point when you said that politics have been put into second and even third place, and economics have been elevated on a religious level, where we had Catholic cathedrals dominating the skylands of the Occident. Now, through the same concept of the architectural, we have banks and financial institutions dominating the skyline. That will point out that to a certain degree we have elevated neoliberal capitalism on the level of religion, and consumerism as its own theology, right?
Right. So it's clear who the enemies are and what the evil...
we won't name them, though, just because I don't want the project being deplatformed.
Right. But we have to show that we know that they are worth little, and we don't admire them. We don't consider them as real leaders, and so on and so forth. So we, can live our lives separately and differently. And hopefully, a generation that grows removed from the present day politics will develop a superior politics of its own. But this contempt for the present day politics must prevail. I mean, it must be encouraged, because you cannot say, oh, well, let's choose Donald Trump because he's the best of the worst. No, you cannot choose him at all, or anyone like him. You cannot compromise, as most of these so-called right-wing people do. And this is very important, I think. You have to be steadfast in your direction. Sorry?
So you do believe that saving the West will encompass a different kind of detached spiritual struggle, which will definitely not be a participation in party politics, etc. Because what we can see rising in the West at the moment is a strong form of nationalism, which is bourgeois in nature, right? But still plebeian in so many aspects. Do you think that these people can bring certain kind of positive change, or will they just replace an already existing status quo with something which would be aesthetically marinated as nationalistic, but still not be the essential change Europe needs?
Right. Populism is just a form of democracy. So it is not the ultimate step. Insofar as they are working against the establishment, there may be, a few members in these groups that are valuable, and you can use them later for higher ends. But by itself, it's not going to succeed because they don't have any religious background, and they, don't have political power either. There'll always be fringe groups and so on. But you need to cultivate people in the right direction, by showing them what the forces are that are really valuable. And one of the forces is the Catholic Church. In fact, I see that there's a lot of criticism of Catholicism and the Pope and so on and so forth. And this is not helpful. And there's a lot of criticism of the European Union, by the way, Eurosceptics and so on. No, that is the only political entity there is for Europe. You have to support it. You can reform it, but you cannot destroy it. That'll lead to chaos. So, you have to work with institutions that you have, but always focusing on a higher ideal that you will realize later. But you cannot destroy what you have, and you cannot be satisfied with compromises. You have to be steadfast in your view and your aspirations. So, there are many things to consider. There's something wrong with this populist phenomenon in general. And I have to point that out because I'm not pleased with it. Because I find that most of these populists, tend to support Trump and the Republicans and the British Conservative Party. All of these are false, parties. They're not conservative.
False messiahs, we can call them, even to a certain degree.
Right. And then that'll only perpetuate the evil in which we are. So you need a different direction, a direction that stems from the past, the European past, more than the American. I don't know much about the American past. I don't think it's terribly valuable. But anyway, so in the history of Europe, before the Russian Revolution, before the Second World War and so on, you have already a lot to build upon. So,
Dr. Jacob, you mentioned the European Union as the ultimate form of European organization, now as a supranational organization. I do agree with you that Europe should stand unified because the political unity of Europe is the expression of its mutual cultural and civilizational belonging. All right. And then you mentioned that it definitely should continue existing, but in a modified form. Before we continue, I want to ask, are you familiar with the work of Francis Parker Yockey, Imperium?
Right. Yes. I read it a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah. For me personally, I take it to be one of the most impactful and meaningful books on political philosophy I ever read in my life. Right. That might be an overstatement, but the book has profoundly influenced my way of thinking. Because it's partly Evola, it's partly Carl Schmitt, it's partly Oswald Spengler. It's a tremendous book. Now, Ulrich Varasch, which was his pen name, in the book, he basically proposes a European unity based on a supranational entity. Now, when you say modifying Europe, do you think that we can build such a cultural, a nation culture, supranational organism he spoke about on the skeleton, on the institutional skeleton of the European Union? Because look, a lot of people would disagree with you. There are a lot of people out there. Sorry.
Right, and that is the defect of this populist phenomenon. They're all Eurosceptics or something. What are they going to do by themselves? there'll be little nations with no power at all, as little France and little Germany and little Italy. This is absurd. No, the European Union was founded, as a unification of all the European states, and it's very valuable because it includes also some Eastern European states now. And rather than, get the East to reorganize the West should include as much of the East as possible, which it is doing, and you shouldn't be obstructing its efforts. By the way, Jean Thiriard was also an enthusiast of Yorkie. Jean-François Thiriard?
I cannot say that I'm familiar with his work.
Okay, I've actually translated some of his works, and he was also a pan-European nationalist, and he also believed that one had to go beyond, petty nationalisms, such as the populist movements and courage, and think of Europe as Europe, and of the Europeans as Europeans. To do that, you need some political framework, and that is already present in the European Union. It began as a commercial kind of federation, but now it is more than that. It has, political, cultural dimensions and so on. So you have to work with that. You cannot be destroying everything you have. There are people trying to destroy the Catholic Church for this reason or that. And then there are people trying to destroy the European Union. These seem to be subversive movements to me.
There are a few points here where I definitely agree with you. That's first and foremost that parochial, local, petty nationalism doesn't have a place in European future, simply because of the fact that it's a dead end. It will lead nowhere. If we have a small petty Germany, small petty France, Italy, and so on, geopolitically speaking, we would be easy picks for local and global juggernauts of power, like America, China, etc. So if we're speaking about Europe continuing its existence as a political force and a separate authentic culture, then we can only speak about a unified Europe. But in terms of the European Union, I disagree, because I believe that the formation of the European Union, as you already mentioned, it had a deeply economic motives, which had nothing to do with retaining the cultural vitalism of Europe. Actually, any kind of culture, we can observe the European Union as something resembling America in a way, because it has become a postmodern hellscape of McDonald's, city malls, consumerism elevated on the highest pillar of moral valuation, etc., etc. So, is it possible to reform the European Union? Personally, I don't know. We cannot prophesy something like that.
No, the European Union is not like America at all. It doesn't look like America. Europe is very different. Its landscape is different. It's full of churches and palaces and full of reminders of a different past than America had. America didn't have much of a past in the first place. So it's not like America at all. It's still Europe. And the people speak different languages than English. It may have a few McDonald's, but that doesn't make it America.
It's more than few, Dr. Jacob. Trust me, it's more than few. We both seen it. What I mean with it's that, in a way, there is a song from a German band called Rammstein, "We're All Living in America." Now, it's an absurd...
I don't like all these subversive bands like Rammstein. All these are post-war phenomena, and they're not reliable. They just dress in Nazi uniforms or something and then attract the populists. No, Europe is Europe. It's not America, and it can easily remain Europe. I worked for 9 years in Eastern Europe, actually, in Russia, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and so on. And I know that the people there are not American at all. And they're not so interested in McDonald's. Maybe in Moscow, in big cities, there are some lines for McDonald's, but not elsewhere. The people are very, very different. No, the European Union is not American. What is American about the European Union is its reliance on NATO. It's part of NATO. It has no standing army of its own, and this it should develop. then it'll be more independent.
So do you believe that Europe should continue with the creation of a more political than an economic European Union, in a way creating a mutual army, reinforce mutual political institutions and so on?
Right, of course. And also, its economic confederation is different from the American. In America, individualism has seeped so far down that everything is private and privatized and so on. Nobody obeys rules. They hate the state, state intervention and so on. They're like an advanced communist state where the state has virtually disappeared and you have show business ruling. So European Union is not like that. It has very strict rules, right, for the production of agricultural products and for manufacture in general. It has different standards. It has its own standards. It's not like America at all, even economically, I think.
No, of course there are certain differences, and Europe is everything that America will never be, although America has a certain strong civilizational, if you let me put it that way, European trait. In the end of the day, yes, it might be its own discourse, but we cannot put aside the thing that the United States of America are primarily a political project of European descended people who took over Protestantism as their creed, etc., because it suited them. And yes, it is a state entity which was formed by those who did not fit into the Catholic-dominated Europe. That's one thing. The second thing is, yes, I do agree with you. Europe cannot be America. Europe has its own metaphysical destiny to be realized. And yeah, the European Union definitely can be used as an institutional framework for the development of a European imperium, right? But I genuinely believe that the European Union of today has a future. It definitely doesn't. Just because it doesn't have a metaphysical platform. It's rather a project which will. I mean, you're well familiar with the founding contracts of the European Union, or the Economic Community. It was called from 1953, right? You're well familiar with them. And the idea was only an economic cooperation, which was expanded later as a political one. But that leads us to your own arguments, that the politics of the European Union serve the economy and the economic reproduction of the European Union. This is the crucial point where it's perfectly fine to disagree. That's normal, I think. This is the point where you and me pretty much don't agree on the subject.
Well, there's nothing wrong with economics in itself. It's when business predominates and takes over politics that you have a great problem. The European Union as an economic organization is not a bad thing. I mean, you need some sort of economic structure to keep all the countries together. And you have a common currency, the euro, and you have all kinds of funding programs where rich countries give aid to poorer countries to develop educational exchange projects and so on. All of these are quite helpful. People moving around the different countries of Europe, learning from each other. So it has also a cultural kind of impact. What is the problem is the development at the top. You see, all changes have to occur at the top. And the problem why the European Union may not seem to be developing is that at the top, it has been colonized by businessmen who are somewhat similar to the American. And so you will find, opera houses with very bad productions, modern productions of operas and so on. And you'll see no encouragement to the continuation of operatic music and so on. This is aristocratic music,
That because we have the rule of quantity, and we have MTV. Why? That's why I mentioned Dr. Jacob. How do we make people want to listen to opera instead of MTV?
Right. For this, you need a different government. As I said, you need strong leaders who are real politicians, conscious of their own history and of their own religion. So you need a new elite, as it were. And of course, the formation of this elite is, I suppose, the subject of this discussion. But the first thing to do is to develop contempt for the present elite. This is not so much the European elite, because they're still European. It is the American or other alien elites that try to influence the high institutions, the cultural institutions of Europe. In all of these European capitals and so on, you have great monuments from the past, palaces and museums and so on. And you will find invariably in front of these august edifices some horrible modern structure. Have you noticed that? There's some modern sculpture or something erected in front of it.
As if yes.
Yeah, this is not happening at the populist level. This is happening through the elites. And, this cannot be discouraged or tolerated. This cannot be encouraged or tolerated. So all of the changes have to occur at the top, and all these subversive elements have to be eradicated from government.
Which again brings us to the beginning of our conversation, which in a way will also serve as the conclusion of the conversation. And I think that the conclusion is that we most certainly need a revival of the aristocratic among a certain strata in our people, which will then dominate the military-industrial complex and establish a new political discourse. We need the concepts which define Western aristocracy and gave birth to the culture, the exceptional European civilization we all love and adore, and we would most certainly love to see it survive the cultural distortion which has been enforced on it in the last, I think since 1789, I would say. Would you agree?
No, not 1789. Mostly after the Second World War, I think.
You would say that this cultural distortion has accelerated after 1945, right?
Right.
Right. Well, I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. It has been an immense privilege, pleasure, and to have you with us today. We had the most interesting conversation, which I believe our viewers enjoyed, and the ones who haven't enjoyed it will be able to find it on YouTube, where they can play it and share it with anyone who they think it would be interesting for. Do you have anything else to say before we conclude this episode?
No, I enjoyed the conversation also, and I hope others did as well, the listeners.
I believe most certainly. Before we actually go, I just wanted to point out that if they want to know more about the topics we discussed, they can most certainly get Nobilitas, a study of European aristocratic philosophy from ancient Greece to the early 20th century by Dr. Alexander Jacob. It is the most profound study on the development of European aristocratic philosophy, and I think it's definitely a mandatory read for your home library, apart with other books which were written by Dr. Jacob. Another one of them is also Richard Wagner on tragedy, Christianity, and the state. I want to announce and to ask Dr. Jacob if he would be interested in doing another episode on Richard Wagner in the near future.
Why, yes. That should be interesting.
Definitely.
I can arrange it, yeah.
So stay tuned with us. Follow up the Warden Post for some dangerous ideas. Take a look at our YouTube channel. Subscribe if you already haven't. Dr. Jacob, once again, thank you very much and take care. Speak to you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.